lead to Rome. This was largely true. Now, the roads that the Romans built were so well constructed. They've been repaired from time to time, but a lot of them are still in service to this day, even in this day of automobiles and buses. Some of these roads are still, your book has a picture of them, but all roads lead to Rome. The roads meant that the Romans could load their produce on carts and carry fairly heavy loads across the way. And of course, if you have a road to go by, you don't have to stop every few minutes and check for directions to make sure you're on the right path. You know, this road leads to Rome. But what if you're in Rome and want to go somewhere else? You just find the right road, and after a while you'll be there. The conquered cities began to want Rome to be successful because as Rome grew, all these other cities grew also. So Rome was able eventually to master all of Italy. The people who were loyal to Rome were given special privileges. Now, I want to state this though in advance. There were some people who Rome could not placate. That is, they could not make a continuous peace with. One such people was Carthage, which we'll talk about shortly. Carthage, Rome could not. And then another were the Jews, another were the Britons, my own ancestors. But the British and Rome could not make a permanent peace. And another were the Druids. They were from Ireland. They were a religious group that practiced human sacrifice. The Romans finally outlawed the Druid religion, and Druidism went underground. But the Romans could not make a permanent peace with some of these people. All right. Now, here we find a problem that Rome had that was to plague them throughout their existence. What did an office mean? Well, it meant one thing to one generation. Then this office becomes ceremonial and mean nothing to a later generation. It would be like being in the army, and this year the general is in charge. But then the colonel happens to be a more forceful man and a better, so eventually the colonel becomes in charge, and then maybe eventually the major becomes in charge because people respect him more than they do the general. This was basically what went wrong with Rome's whole constitutional system. Every office that they had eventually fell by the wayside, including, we're going to find later, the office of emperor. All their offices. Now, in our Constitution, we specify, and I'll quote a little bit of it, the president shall have power. Congress shall have power. And our Constitution, the last 200 years, with a president who largely has the same power, the same authority that our original president had, and the Congress still has. But now there have been some changes made. And one really, really, really big change that reminds me of the Roman times. The Supreme Court is never given the power of judicial review in our Constitution. Our Supreme Court usurped that power. Again, this reminds me of Roman times where an officer would usurp power that was supposed to be given to another branch of government. And today, the Supreme Court is extremely powerful, more powerful, so powerful I don't even hardly consider our government democracy anymore. The Supreme Court makes all of our moral decisions for us, our elected officials don't. They can vote something 5-4, and it's the law of the land. And how do you overturn it? Well, supposedly by constitutional amendment, it's only happened twice in history. The first time it happened was the infamous Dred Scott decision, where the Supreme Court made a decision that black people had no rights at all. That decision took the deaths of 600,000 men on the battlefield to overturn. The next one, and most of you probably aren't aware of this, in 1912, Congress passed an income tax law. Someone took the Supreme Court declared the income tax to be unconstitutional. There was a constitutional amendment, the 16th, I believe, that said that income tax was legal. That was in 1912, 106 years ago. That's the last time a Supreme Court decision has been overturned by a constitutional amendment. Do you call that checks and balances? Maybe you do, I don't. But anyway, we do have a case here where that one branch of government usurped power, which is typical of what was happening to Rome throughout its history. So you find at the beginning of the government they had certain offices, and then these offices would come to nothing after a while. For instance, there were the consuls. There were 2 consuls, and they were supposedly equal in power. They didn't want a king, and the consuls were not hereditary, but the consuls were equal in power. Each could stop the other if they wanted to. Two consuls. Also, there were the praetors. They became the chief executive officers in the Roman Republic. They could lead armies if they wanted to, but there came the praetors. But after a while, these 2 offices came to nothing. Like I said, it got so bad that even the office of the emperor finally came to nothing. All right. Karl Marx said that all history is a story of class conflict. No, he was wrong, but there is such a thing as class conflict, and Rome went through a period of class conflict between its upper classes and lower classes. The upper classes, the patricians; the lower classes, the plebeians. The patricians and plebeians fought because the plebeians felt like the patricians got too big of a share of the pie. And eventually, though, the patricians came to realize that, hey, we need the plebeians. Number one, the patricians did not build the roads, did not do the work. The patricians did not do much of the farming. It was mostly done by the poor people. When it came time to fighting, yeah, the patricians would join the army all right, but they were the officers who stayed back at a distance and watched the fight while the plebeians did all the actual hardcore sword swinging and fighting and took most of the lumps. So the patricians needed the plebeians. So finally, they got together and worked out a peace called let's see if I can find here on the notes. Struggle of the Orders. I said Struggle of the Orders. The Struggle of the Orders was a series of laws that finally allowed patricians to marry plebeians, which had been strictly forbidden before this time. A patrician was expected to only marry another patrician. Now, folk, this might have been the one thing that kept Rome going as long as it did. If the patricians had always only been allowed to marry patricians, eventually there would have been a whole lot of inbreeding going on, and the patrician class would have become feeble of mind and feeble of body, which is what happened to a lot of kings in Europe. One of the most inbred kings in Europe was Spanish King Philip IV, and even he knew that he was inbred, feeble of mind, feeble of body, and very, very sickly all of his life. But anyway, by allowing the patricians and plebeians to intermarry, it staved off the inbreeding that would have probably would have come about had this struggle for the orders not been passed. Also, the plebeians were given 2 tribunes, 2 of them, and these tribunes had a power called veto power. Now again, Rome, the United States has copied a lot of Rome. Our government, we have veto. Almost all of our governors have veto power. The president has veto power. Veto means if we don't like the law that's passed, we will say no to that law. Once we've said no, the law will not become law. The tribunes would meet in the government assembly, coming from the plebeian class. They'd listen in on the meetings, and if something went on that they didn't like, they might shout out or scream out veto, or means Latin, I forbid. Eventually, the class struggles gave way to other struggles with foreigners. A new group of people called nobles Now, the difference between a noble and an ordinary rich man, the nobles had a legal status. In other words, you got to be a noble mostly by being born into it. And if you weren't born into it, if you became rich enough and got the right persons on your side, you might could get a law passed making you a noble person. But the nobles passed their titles on to the next generation. Very significant, because the nobles were destined to govern Europe for the next 24 or so hundred years. Up until World War I, in other words, basically until about 100 years ago in Europe, the nobles were still controlling a lot of Europe. World War I broke the power of the nobility in Germany, in Austria, and especially in Russia. And of course, the power of the nobles has already been broken in Britain. Britain kept its nobles, gave them, the titles. They still have the title. They still have a House of Lords, but the nobles long ago ceased to have power in Britain. But the nobles ran Europe for a couple of thousand years. All right. Now we come to the next episode of the Punic Wars. The city of Carthage was located right around here in North Africa, near what is today Tunisia, on the Mediterranean Sea. Carthage had started out as a colony of the Phoenicians, where the Phoenicians were Canaanites, and they colonized this area here, and Carthage became fairly rich and powerful through trade. But the problem with the people of Carthage was they practiced a lot of the practice of the Canaanites, including witchcraft, infant sacrifice, trying to use magic, particularly to use magic to mind control the masses. They had a lot of priests among them who exercised mental and psychological control over the masses, over the common people. And this was Carthage. They became powerful. In the story, though, about the Carthage claimed Sicily. Now, Sicily was much closer to Italy than it was to Rome, or still is, much closer to Italy than it is to Rome. The Romans claimed Sicily. Carthage claimed Sicily, so they fought a war about it. The first war was very difficult, long and hard, lasted a good many years. It ended with the defeat of Carthage. Now, here was the thing about Carthage. Carthage had a different religion from Rome, worshipped altogether different gods, spoke a different language. The Romans were never able to get them on their side. The Punic Wars lasted approximately 100 years. There were times between the wars where there were maybe 20-year periods of peace, but the wars would last many, many years once they started, because it would take Rome a long time to defeat them. And then Carthage would be put down and then come back, be put down and come back. Now, this is very important I say this so you'll understand what happened later. In their own country's history, all right, the Confederacy fought long and hard and fought well and fought with a lot of courage, but when the Confederate States saw they were whipped, they quit fighting. The American Indians, they fought on high ground. They had it about the American Indians. Here this is the white man. The white man was not keeping his treaties. The land had belonged to them first, but when the American Indians realized they were licked, they finally quit fighting. The Japanese, they fought fanatically. They believed in fighting to the death, but when they saw they were licked, they quit fighting. There are some people, though, who will not quit fighting. Carthage was one of those. It's kept coming at you, kept coming at you. Now, we have people like that in the world today. There is a certain group that has been fighting the rest of the world for at least 1,400 years with no sign of it ending. I'll talk more about that when we come to chapter 7. But again, the people of Carthage would not quit. Now, Carthage began to make inroads. Once they'd lost Sicily, they went to Spain. And they tried to conquer Spain, but in the meantime, Rome went to Spain itself, and they made Spain a Roman province. So, Carthage and Rome clashed over Spain. During the Second War, a general named Hannibal, instead of invading Italy directly, Hannibal went into Spain, and then went across the Alps and hit Italy by surprise from across the snowy Alps, leading a bunch of elephants. The general's name was Hannibal. He goes down in history as perhaps one of the greatest generals of all time, but the problem was, from the very beginning, he was fighting a losing battle, even though he probably didn't know that, but he was outnumbered. Now, once in Italy, he scourged the land of Italy for some 20 years. He would not fight a decisive fight against Rome, but he would get a small town. He left the major cities alone. Hit a small town, hit him, and then run before the main Roman army could get him. Hit another small town, and then run. But he did fight one major fight at a place called Cunae. I want to kind of diagram what happened here. This is the Roman army, and this is Hannibal. Wait, I better reverse that, don't I? Because the way I went. This is the Roman army, and this is Hannibal. Now, Hannibal ordered his center. Now, just as you fight in the center, pull back. Just pull back a little bit. So, as they were fighting, the wings were told to hold steady, the flanks, hold steady. So this is Hannibal here, and this is Rome here. As the fighting went on, Hannibal began to close ranks. The Romans, not realizing what was happening, continued to think they were winning because they were advancing. The center was advancing, and the flanks were holding steady. Then Hannibal's men closed in, front and back, and they had all the Roman soldiers trapped front and back. And in those days, I mean, the Roman soldiers had no protection on their backsides. It was all, their armor was all on the front. You know, and they had to keep them. And once Hannibal's men got behind the Romans, they slaughtered them. And when the battle was over, Hannibal's men got some bushel baskets and went and collected all the wealth they could from the dead Roman soldiers and officers. All men and officers alike were killed. Well, finally, though, a Roman general, Scipio, outplanned Hannibal. Scipio said, I know what to do. I think we can defeat him if we go and attack Carthage itself. After all, Hannibal is here in Italy, and Carthage has no significant army there in Carthage. Let's go across the Mediterranean and attack Carthage itself. Hannibal was forced to leave Italy to defend Carthage. In the battle, Carthage is defeated, and Scipio, this is in your book. Scipio became very upset as he watched the defeat. Carthage said, hey, Babylon has been defeated. Troy has been defeated and utterly destroyed. So is Babylon. And now we're destroyed. He said, does this mean that Rome is going to be utterly destroyed also? Well, Rome wound up being defeated a few times, not utterly destroyed. But Scipio became really concerned that, hey, is it the fate of all cities to rise, become great, and then be destroyed? Well, anyway, they clobbered the people of Carthage, but 50 years later, Carthage came back. And by this time, Carthage was still weak from the wars, the first two wars. This time, the Romans went in. They completely destroyed the city of Carthage, and the people they didn't kill, they sold to slavery. they plowed up the ground of Carthage with salt. So they basically put a bunch of salt in the ground to guarantee that Carthage would never produce crops again. Carthage was rebuilt, but it never, salt can be washed away from the soil, it's difficult. But Carthage never amounted to anything. Now, I ran into a web page, maybe 7 or 8 months ago, that accused the Roman people of nothing less than genocide. In other words, genocide is the act of wiping out a people completely and entirely. Each of you can make up your mind for yourself what you think of that. But I want to say there are some people you cannot make peace with. There are some people you cannot deal with. And you have to equip them until they stop fighting. And if they don't, you have to keep with them. And if they still don't stop fighting, our modern day political correctness will not allow us to do today what Rome did to Carthage. But I want to remind you, the people you don't conquer wind up coming up and conquering you. What is significant about these wars? All right. I taught this in this morning's class, and a couple of the young men in the back again gave me a look like I was a little bit off the rock, but here's the point I want to make. If Carthage had won, European civilization would have soon gone into the Dark Ages from which it might not have recovered. We'd still be possibly using candles instead of light bulbs. No one would have ever invented the automobile, the airplane, or learned to use electricity. Now at this point, some of the men in the back of the room this morning act like, hey, someone would have invented these things because they named some way it could be done. You younger people are conditioned to believe that the natural order of things is upward, upward, upward. But to me, the natural order of things is downward, downward, downward. Things move upward only when some people force them to move upward. No, water only goes uphill when it's pumped uphill. Leave water to itself, it will flow downhill. Leave culture to itself, the culture will go downhill. The culture only goes uphill when people force it. And of course, one of the men in the class spoke up and said, I've been to places where they don't have electricity or running water, and they live the way they lived 1,000 years ago, in some cases longer than that. There's still a lot of places in the world where they don't have these things. So if Carthage had won, there is a chance that Europe would not be the Europe we know, and mankind, particularly the Western man, would have been plunged into the Dark Ages from which it might not have come out of even to this day. This was a battle between light and darkness, between good and evil. Rome had a better civilization than Carthage. There was a battle for the future of the Western civilization, and for that matter, a battle for the future of mankind. All right. So much for Carthage for now. Now, once Rome had Carthage, without them perhaps even meaning to, with Carthage they had all of the Western Mediterranean. They had the Mediterranean. They still did not have the Eastern world. In 243 BCE, they went in and conquered Greece, and that gave them a lot more of the Mediterranean. And then there was a kingdom of Pergamum, which is in what is today Turkey. The king of Pergamum said, I know what's going to happen. Rome is going to conquer the known world anyway. So when he died, instead of willing his crown to his son, he willed his crown to Rome. Basically gave Rome his lands for nothing. And this gave Rome some eastern territory. Once they had started to fall in motion, you might say there was nothing to stop them. A lot of historians say there's no evidence that Rome ever intended to conquer the known world. Well, how did they get it? You might say by default. There's a historian, he was alive the last time I checked, even though he's been around a long time, named Tom Jones, who wrote several books about ancient history. And he stated that Rome was built on decaying foundations. In other words, Rome had the seeds of its own destruction sown right from the beginning. The whole Western world was in a state of decline and heading for the Dark Ages, which eventually they went into and pulled out of. But Rome was able to rule these people because they were falling apart. A sheer lack of justice. Now, I'll give you an example. In the land of Judea, where the Jews were, and this is something that every Jew will admit, so that I'm not being anti-Jew, but the Jews had no justice. Their justice openly favored the wealthy and the rich at the expense of the poor people. And people got to that finally 2 men went to Rome and said, will you please come over here and conquer us and put some justice in our system, because we have none. So Rome went in 63 BCE, they conquered Judea. They had to conquer them again in 70 CE. Then they had to conquer them again in 135, but and in 135 the Romans told all the Jews, leave Judea and don't come back. And it was to be 1948 before Israel reassembles the nation. Again, because Rome could not placate the Jews, just like they couldn't placate the Carthaginians and couldn't placate the Britons either. All right. Now, in time of war, and folk, this is the danger that democracies have. War seems to be inevitable, something that we have not learned how to solve the problem of warfare. But in time of war, your central government can take over. Now, during the Civil War, both Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy, ruled with like absolute dictators. The Constitution was largely suspended. Much of it was suspended. Habeas corpus was suspended by Abraham Lincoln. Well, during the Punic Wars, Rome was never quite the same after that. The Senate was running the war at first, and they got a lot of power. However, and this is the danger you have, the generals also became very, very powerful during the war, particularly generals like Marius and Sulla, whom I'll talk about in a few minutes. They became extremely powerful, and eventually this was to lead to the downfall of the Republic and lead to Rome becoming controlled by hereditary dynasties. But that was to come about slowly. It did not come about overnight. The wars. The wars had a very, very negative effect on family life. Before the wars, a Roman soldier might go out and fight in the spring and be home in the fall and spend all fall at home with his family, and then not have to go out until he got this garden, his crop plowed and ready to go. Then he'd go out and fight in his wars. But with the Punic Wars, this eventually lasted many, many years, and soldiers would go away and be gone for several years. And this had a really bad effect on family life. For one thing, oftentimes their wives could not manage the farm without them. Farms fell into neglect, and a lot of small farms found their way in the hands of the rich because the wife would be forced to sell the farm. Of course, many soldiers died. Some soldiers came home permanently crippled, unable to work anymore. And of course, there's always the case when during a prolonged war, a soldier might come home and find his wife married to someone else. This has happened in many, actually probably